Okay, welcome back. I am going to record the lecture from last night and I'm going to start from the beginning because half of the class wasn't able to make it into campus. So um, let's go ahead and play from the start. Okay, so this lecture is on measurement, reliability, and validity specific to measurement. So, an overview, measurement links concepts to observable indicators. And as I discussed in class last night, that would be like depression is a concept, right? It's abstract. Let me move my face because I feel the need to look at people. Well, I would rather not look at myself. If I can see myself, it'll look like I'm looking at you more than off to the side. Sorry. I don't know why I feel like I have to look at people. Okay, so if we have depression, for example, that's the concept. Depression is abstract, right? Like, how do we know that someone has depression? And as several of you noted, the symptoms, right? Those are the observable indicators. Is there difficulty sleeping? Do they feel sad? Do they have fatigue? Are there changes in eating, weight gain, weight loss, things like that? Those are the observable indicators of the concept of depression. And so when we look at the questions on a depression measure, right? Depression as the concept, all of the items, the questions are asking about the observable indicators. Weak measurement undermines research quality in all aspects of research. If we're not using appropriate measurement and careful with our design of using measurement, we can't really trust the results that we get at the end of the study. Measurement is central to assessment and evaluation. And I want to clarify again, for us as practitioners or clinicians, assessment is that back and forth discussion that you have with clients where you're gathering information and trying to make decisions about what the client needs and where to move forward. Evaluation is where you're actually measuring and tracking change over time. Measurement is required to inform both. Measurement informs evaluation in terms of helping you objectively determine where your client is in terms of progress of change. And that then informs your assessment as well. If you are doing an intervention with a client and they're not improving on the scales that you're using, you would want to consider, is there a problem with the scales, the measurement? Or is it that the intervention isn't doing the job that you want it to do? Or are there external factors that are affecting this that maybe also need to be considered in your intervention? Maybe you need to add an additional interventions instead of changing it. Maybe you need to back up and do what we call a stepped approach in intervention, where you build, like self-regulation skills before you apply a trauma-related intervention, because I'm going to end up stressing my client and I need to help them learn how to deal with the stress before I stress my client, right? All right, hopefully that helps. And here, there we go. Okay. So measurement error, we have some issues with this. There's a systematic error that biases results, and this is due to some kind of design flaw in our approach to measurement, okay? There's random error, which reduces consistency. Random error is random, and it can be from all different types of things. As a researcher, we typically address this statistically. For you all, you're going to be sort of looking for this when you're graphing information about what you've evaluated in your clients, when you're tracking your clients' progress. If you notice that there was like some wonky patterns, clients doing really good, and then all of a sudden they do bad, For you, random error might mean, hey, what happened at this point last week, right? Your symptoms like flared really bad. And you might discover that something's happening in their life. That might be a random error, right? Both of these things threaten the credibility of evaluating clients, programs, any type of research that we do. So bias in measurement. First, we have social desirability bias. I won't repeat the example that I used last night, but I will say this essentially means that a person gives you the answer they think you want to hear because they fear judgment. They think that if they give you the truth, that you will judge them negatively based on that. And social desirability bias is strong. Oftentimes in research, we will see where in specific situations, it's even recommended to remove the interviewer, the person gathering information, as much as possible in order to reduce social desirability bias. So oftentimes this is done with like online anonymous surveys and things like that. Cultural bias. The most common cultural bias that we see in research is the Anglo-American ethnocentric perspective that everybody who looks like me, therefore, our experiences are universally applicable to everyone. And as you have been and will continue to learn, culture affects individual development and it affects individual experiences, which affects their risks and protective factors, which affects their needs in terms of treatment. And when research doesn't consider cultural variation, it becomes a cultural bias, okay? And you'll often hear me harp on representation in samples where we have too many Anglo-American white people in a sample and not enough representation from especially marginalized groups in the population. That is a significant cultural bias within a study. And that's a perfect example of a systematic form of bias. Question wording effects. So developing questions is complex. Trying to make sure that a question is clear, concise, and is going to be easily understood across everybody who reads it is challenging. In taking the first quiz, there's a good chance that a lot of you experienced this, where maybe you felt like the question was clear, but the answers were unclear, or the question was unclear, but the answers you could understand, but couldn't really connect them to the question. This is a wording effect. So when I said, I evaluate all of the items, I have this tipping point, and if it hits this tipping point, I consider it a bad item. What I'm actually looking for is this, question wording effects. So when I dropped item 8 from quiz 1, that was me acknowledging, I think there's a question wording effect in item 8, so I am going to give credit back for that particular item to all of the students. Hopefully that makes sense. Because I'm not able to get nodding or questions from you all, so pardon me talking myself. Reducing measurement error. So how do we do this? We use clear language first and foremost. And oftentimes this is done through we create questionnaires or we use questionnaires that are already established that we know work and don't have these issues. But when we're creating questions like you won't be creating individualized rating scales, but there are things called individualized rating scales. That's in the clinical eval course. We want to check and make sure that the people who are going to be filling out these questions are going to understand them. And so we'll often do pilot runs or test runs of measures before we accept that they are usable. And these are always published. and they talk about them. Okay, they'll even give you examples of the items, and they'll do statistical tests of the items and how they work across different people. And that's the pilot test instruments. And then there's the triangulation approach. And this is where we are essentially having more than one set of eyes, potentially from different groups, looking at these measures and the questions within the measures to see if they all are in agreement, that they understand them, that they make sense, and that they should, easily be understood by the population that we plan to apply these measurements to. This would be like researchers collaborating with clinicians, collaborating with other experts in the field, colleagues, things like that. So that's triangulation. And the whole idea is that we need to all come to a consensus that yes, we've hit the mark. Okay. All right. Reliability. Reliability is the consistency of measurement, that it performs the same every time. It's like if I say, I'm going to pick you up and drive you into class every week on Wednesday, and I'm going to be there at 5:45 to pick you up. If I show up every week at 5:45 on the dot and I am never late and nothing ever happens, you could say she's reliable. If she says she's going to be there at 5:45, she's going to be there at 5:45. I am consistently doing what I am expected to do. That's what we mean when we're talking about reliability for a measure. Also, there should be low random error when a measure is reliable, meaning that it's not spontaneously acting strangely or differently than it is expected to function. It functions the same every single time because there's very low random error. They've done everything they can to try to remove it from the items in the questionnaire. And there are different types of reliability. There's test, retest, which is how a measure works on the same person every time they use it, okay? And that means that if I take a measure 3 different times or 5 different times in a row, it works the same on me every single time that I take it. There's inter-rater reliability, which means if I and 3 of you rate or score the measure, we are going to rate the measure the same, okay, each time. That when we evaluate the measure and how a person has answered questions on it, that we are in agreement consistently every single time of what that final score should be. And then there's internal consistency, which is what's often considered reliability. And that's where we use the statistics the most, and that's Cronbach's alpha. And we need that to be no less than 0.7, okay? That means it is consistently working the same across different people, okay? So not just me and every time I take it, but me and each and every one of you, it works the same on each and every one of you. And when we see variation in internal consistency, this is usually due to cultural bias, where a measure has not been tested enough for its reliability across different populations in order to determine if it functions differently due to cultural effects. So why would cultural effects matter? Because culture is not just based on positive things that we experience. Culture is also based on the negative things that we experience. And marginalized communities have different experiences that affect them in profound ways. And that changes a lot of different things about us as individuals, just as protective factors do, right? Just as privilege does. And so we need to be sure that measures are tested across multiple populations and that representation of multiple populations is present, and you'll find there are a lot of gaps in that. It's frustrating for clinicians, it's frustrating for researchers. All I can tell you is I do my best to address it in my own research, but not everybody does. In 2019, they tested it again and found that we really aren't doing much better as a research community as a whole in terms of addressing cultural bias and getting more representative samples, which does affect how we interpret internal consistency. So a measure could say, look at the reliability on this. It's a 0.9. This is incredible. And then you look at every sample it's ever been tested on, and they're all Anglo-American white, right? That's not really good internal consistency. That's great internal consistency for Anglo-American white. But if that internal consistency reliability drops when we start looking at marginalized populations, it means that we've got a systematic bias in there due to cultural bias, okay? All right, validity. Validity addresses the accuracy of a measure. And this means, is it measuring what we want it to measure? Okay, does the measure capture the concept? So if we're looking at depression, is it measuring depression? And there are lots of different ways we do that. I'm going to explain that further here shortly. It requires sound operationalization. What does that mean? It means that the concept or construct needs to be clearly defined, clearly defined. So if we use depression as an example, what is depression? So an easy way to think about this is when we think about the symptoms of depression, okay, and the things that we ask about in relation to depression, those are ways that we have used to define depression, if that makes sense, right? That depression is the manifestation of these specific symptoms. So we have to be very clear about how we operationalize or define a construct or concept. Okay, types of validity. I'm going to go into some more detail here. We have face validity, which is just at face value. You're looking at the items and you can see that the items make sense in relation to what you're trying to measure. So if you look at a depression measure and it's asking about happiness, they're not necessarily two sides of the coin. A person can struggle with depression and still have moments of happiness. But if you're asking about, sadness, fatigue, sleep issues, slowing down, feeling hopeless or helpless, things like that, those are indicators that we have accepted are symptoms, right? Or observable indicators of depression. So face validity is where we just look at a questionnaire and we read the questions and we go, okay, yes, this looks like it makes sense within the concept of depression. Now, normally for research, when a measure is being created, face validity is evaluated by a review board of experts in the field. Okay, so they'll gather a bunch of clinicians, theorists, and researchers, and they'll go, okay, these are the items we think that are related. They'll use the DSM. And then the review board will evaluate it and they will decide what they think works, what they think doesn't, if things need to be potentially reworded or adjusted, those kinds of things. Okay, now let's talk about content, criterion, and construct validity. All three of these are different. There's some overlap, so I'm going to focus on what is the true distinction between them. So when we talk about validity, we're asking whether a measure truly captures the concept we think it does. Okay, let's keep depression as our example. Content validity asks whether we included all the important parts of the concept. If we're measuring depression but ignore sleep problems and appetite changes, our measure lacks content validity. It's missing indicators that are observable to help us measure depression. Criterion validity asks whether our measure, our questionnaire, aligns with some external standard, another measure that has already been developed, that's already been standardized, that is already accepted and well used. If our depression scale correlates strongly with, like, clinical diagnosis or the Beck Depression Inventory or the PHQ-9, then that supports our criterion validity. Okay? Construct validity is more broad. It's theoretically based, right? It asks whether the measure behaves the way theory predicts. Does depression correlate with anxiety, for example? And it should to some degree. Does it negatively relate to self-esteem? And it should. Theoretically, the more depressed we are, the worse we feel about ourselves, right? Does it avoid correlating with unrelated traits, right? So depression shouldn't necessarily correlate with the flavor of ice cream that you prefer, right? I'm using a ridiculous example, but I'm trying to be as ridiculous as I can to make it clear. If it's not related to depression at all, it shouldn't correlate, meaning it shouldn't have a relationship statistically with it. So content validity is about coverage of the observable traits. Criterion validity is about comparison, comparing the measure with another standard accepted measure to make sure they work the same. Okay? Yes, they both are related to each other, so that suggests they are measuring the same construct. Okay? And construct is about theoretical coherence, the idea that it fits with the underlying theories of what we understand about that particular construct, like depression. Okay. I'm hoping that, yes, you can see my screen. So each one addresses different threats to validity. And when you look at a research article that is looking at the psychometric properties of a measure, psychometric properties is a universal term addressing reliability and validity. They're going to talk about a lot of different types of these, okay? That's what they're doing, is trying to prove it's measuring the same every single time, and it is measuring what we want it to measure. And these are the 4 different ways that we have evaluated that it is measuring what we want it to measure. All right, so reliability versus validity. Why am I repeating myself? Because students get this, that people, everyone, even researchers sometimes I've seen, well, people with research degrees anyway, can get these confused. So reliable measures may be invalid, meaning they work the same every time, but they don't actually measure what they're supposed to measure. A perfect example of this, I hope most of you know what an analog clock is, face clock with the arms on it. Well, when the battery or power dies to a face clock, the hands stop where they are. Even a broken clock, analog clock, is right twice a day. If it stops, right, at 3 o'clock, an analog clock will be right at 3 a.m. and 3 p.m. Okay? But that doesn't mean that it's valid. It's not actually telling you the time. It just happened to, on those 2 occasions, be correct. The rest of the time, it's wrong. But it is reliably going to tell you that it is 3 o'clock every time that you look at it, right? So reliable measures may be invalid, and that means they're no good. Valid measures require reliability. So even if it's measuring what we want it to measure, it still needs to work the same every single time we use it for every person that we use it on. If it changes how it works between me and you, then we can't trust the scores that it gives us. We don't know then that change in a program or change in a research study or change across clients is actually because change is occurring. It could be just because the measure isn't reliable and it's working differently across people. So we need it to be valid, measure exactly what it's supposed to measure, and we need it to be reliable. Work the same way every single time across everybody. Okay? Both of these are essential. All right, so let's review the readings, the extra readings that were given for the week. So Povey and colleagues published a study in 2012. They used a mixed methods approach, which is where they used qualitative and quantitative data. Now, in terms of this class, just want to refresh your memory. Quantitative means it's questions that can be quantified into a numerical value. Qualitative is going to really ask for people to dig deeper in a conversational style about their lived experience. And that uses what we call thematic coding. Okay. Don't worry. We're going to keep talking about these concepts as you're building your questions and then as we are analyzing the data. So mixed methods means they did both a qualitative, tell me about your lived experience in detail, and quantitative, let me ask questions that I can give numerical value to so I can statistically analyze this with a mathematical approach. And they did this with families with a child with Down syndrome. They used a validated quantitative measure, or several of them. They integrated the qualitative findings within the context of, okay, here's what we found mathematically, and then here's how they describe their lived experiences and what we learned from that, and how do these two fit together? So what were the key findings that Povey and colleagues found? First, behavior problems did predict poorer family functioning, which as practitioners, you all would anecdotally completely understand. If a child has behavior problems, it's going to predict poorer family functioning. Overall functioning comparable to typical families who didn't have behavioral problems. And that there were challenges to deficit models, the approaches, and considerations of how we think about things. So what were the measurement lessons from this particular article? Validated tools matter. Okay, now in our particular study, they're not as universal, just because quite a few of the constructs that you all came up with when we were originally designing the study are observable traits, okay? And they fit under constructs, but some of those observable traits aren't really already embedded in standardized measures. So most of you are going to have to create some quantitative questions. You'll find maybe one or two questions from a standardized measure, but then you'll have some of your observable traits where you can't find anything, so you have to create questions. That's okay. We're going to have to do this as we work through it. But that validated tools matter. It changes outcomes if we don't use validated tools. Controls reduce confounding. So what do we mean by there? It means that we need to control for possible variables or issues that we think are affecting a program, a study, a lived experience, or a client. That could be causing change in the outcome that we aren't actually considering in the research design. So a control is where we're either controlling for it statistically, so we remove it from the mathematical model, or we build it into the design of a study, where sometimes we'll do what's called a block design, and that's where we will sample only from a specific group of people because we want them all to be very similar. We don't want there to be variations, right, in the group that could cause our results to look wonky in the end. We want to be able to trust them. So say you're really interested in outcomes in adolescents who are in inpatient psychiatric care, you likely would design a study that is a block design where you're only looking at adolescents in inpatient care. And then you want to look at differences in an intervention, right, within that group. That's a block design. You're intentionally saying, I want to control for variation within the group. I don't want to compare this intervention to adolescents who are not in inpatient psychiatric care because I already know they're different. They're not in inpatient psychiatric care, right? So those are different ways of controlling what we call confounding, where something else externally is affecting the outcomes of a program, a community, an individual, whatever we're looking at. Mixed methods do strengthen conclusions. Using both qualitative and quantitative research together do strengthen conclusions because it just gives us more information. It doesn't just answer the question of what variables are associated, but the qualitative gives us more information about the how and the why, right? Based on the lived experiences that we're getting information from the participants. So the authors argued using both together really strengthens a research approach. I will say, normally these are very distinct approaches. You have quantitative researchers, you have qualitative researchers. I've engaged in both. I've attempted one mixed method study with a colleague. And we got kickback on the quantitative part because qualitative research has smaller sample sizes. Quantitative research requires larger sample sizes just because of the math. And you don't have to understand the math, so I'm not going to go into it. But being able to use both and gathering both information is important. To be able to connect this to you and what you would do every day, you are doing, or hopefully will be doing, mixed methods approaches. So let's say you go on and you become a clinician. Okay, you'll learn, if you take clinical eval, you'll learn more about evaluating specifically clients directly, and a lot more about measurement. But when you are checking in with your client every single week and you do your initial assessment where you're gathering all the information and getting their background and you're kind of getting an idea of this is what my client needs and what's going on. And then you check in every week with them through these discussions. And then you're also evaluating them. You're measuring and tracking progress over time. Let's say you're dealing with depression and you're watching those depression scores hopefully drop. Suggesting that their depression is fading and going away. You're naturally doing a mixed methods approach in clinical practice, right? Your assessment, those weekly check-ins, the conversations, the discussions, the gathering new information, taking it within the context of you graphing and tracking your client's progress over time, that is a mixed methods approach. Okay. So some key takeaways here. Measurement quality determines usefulness of the findings that we have, and the usefulness of the measure itself. Reliability and validity are foundational, and we don't trust that reliability and validity are present for any measure. I don't care if standardized is in the name. I don't care if it's been used forever. We have to check. So we literally have to search and see, has this been studied on my client's population for reliability and validity? Because if it hasn't, then you have to proceed using the measure with caution and accept the fact that it may not actually be as accurate in measuring depression in your client compared to who it actually was normed on. And normed is where they standardize it, where they say it is reliable, valid, and it has been built upon this group of people. But oftentimes those researchers will generalize their statements as if this applies to everyone, okay? But if there are absolutely no immigrants, first generation immigrants in the sample, well, then we don't know that it's measuring the same construct in them, and we don't know that it's working the same every single time with them, right? So reliability and validity cannot be trusted to be present. We do have to check. And how do you check? a simple Google Scholar search. You go to Google Scholar, you type in the name of the measurement, you type in reliability and validity, or you can do psychometric properties. You probably have to run both because it's based on key terms. And we are terrible about picking key terms. It depends on where we live in the world and what profession we're in. And that's what actually pulls up those articles. We pick those key terms. So you would probably have to test both. So you would name of the measure and psychometric properties or reliability and validity, and as a Boolean search term, right? Capital A and D, and the name of your client's population, and see if it has actually been tested and standardized, normed on your client's population. If you find that gap, first, feel free to be offended. Second, don't be surprised. And third, it doesn't mean you can't use the measure, but it does mean that you need to search and see if you can find one that either more closely fits your population or has definitely been tested on your population. There are many times where we have to make compromises, right? And so it just depends on what you're doing in terms of research. Okay, and applied studies do illustrate concepts better. So what we're essentially saying is that being able to show this in real time in community settings or individual settings, it illustrates the concepts better and helps us understand them better and get better at measuring them. Okay, so let's look at an applied teaching example on a micro level, okay, for measurement. The concept is depression severity among adult clients, okay? A poor measure would have single yes, no questions about feeling sad. That's it. Do you feel sad? Yes or no? An improved measure would be a validated scale like the PHQ-9, which many of you have probably seen at your internships if you've started them already. The teaching point that I want to make here is that operationalization, or the definition, how we define these constructs, shapes the conclusions that we can draw from these measures, okay? And a perfect example of this, for those of you that are interested in trauma, I did a systematic review on PTSD versus complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and what I thought the mechanism was that, linked them or made them distinct, and was able to show that there's a clear neurobiological pathway of progression, right? That if PTSD is left chronic long enough, neurobiological changes emerge that change the way that the brain functions, which manifests into the symptoms we see in CPTSD. However, then it changes treatment needs just because it is a progression of PTSD. Now that the brain is functioning differently, interventions that work on PTSD no longer work on CPTSD. What I discovered in terms of operationalization is that CPTSD, because it's not in our DSM, and we're the only people in the world really who use it, the ICD has CPTSD, that some researchers considered CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as chronic PTSD. They were still classifying it as the original core PTSD symptoms, but they were using the same acronym. And so in that review, I literally had to note exclusion criteria of saying, anybody who operationalized this different than the way that the ICD operationalizes CPTSD was removed from the review, because we're not talking about two different disorders. We need to talk about this specific one and the way that it is defined, operationalized. Okay? I hope that helps. All right, so another applied teaching example in terms of measurement bias. So the scenario, client reports substance use drinking intake. The risk is social desirability bias. Remember, we talked about that. It leads to underreporting. Your client is concerned that you're going to judge them for how much they actually drink. Okay. So they forget conveniently half or so of what they actually do, or the time of day that they actually do it, or the days of the week that they actually do it, or whether or not they do it alone, right? That's social desirability bias. So the strategy is to normalize behaviors and ensure confidentiality. Now, there was some question from the last quiz about the difference between anonymity and confidentiality. Anonymity is when we don't know who a participant is or who a person is after we have collected data from them. Confidentiality is where we know who they are, but we ensure that their information is protected and that no one will find out who they are or the information about them. And you all have probably already learned about when we are required to violate that confidentiality and how you have to disclose that, right? If there is concern they will harm themselves or someone else, we have to break that confidentiality, right? So the strategy is to normalize the behaviors. Hey, this is okay. It's pretty common, if people have a hard day to feel like they need to unwind and have a drink at night, or some people who struggle with sleeping might find that they start using alcohol to help them sleep. Is this something that you found? Does it affect your sleeping at all? These are different practical and clinical approaches to normalizing behaviors within the context of practice. And then ensuring the confidentiality aspect of it, that nobody's going to find out about this. This is confidential between you and I, which technically you should cover on the very first day before you have collected any personal information from them. And I've seen many recorded videos where students say the confidentiality after they've already gotten some heartbreaking, gut-wrenching, sordid details from their client, and then they talk about confidentiality. It needs to be the first thing out of your mouth after your introductions, right? We lay everything on the table up front, and then we work to build rapport and trust. So the main teaching point here is that bias, the different types of bias, threatens validity, not honesty. Okay. Honesty is a whole different thing, and your therapeutic alliance is going to affect honesty significantly. So Carl Rogers talked about this and was proven right over 30 years of trying to prove him wrong. Your therapeutic alliance is the greatest agent of change for your client, and that it is a direct manifestation of the development of trust as a result of unconditional positive regard. And that unconditional positive regard for your client normalizes their behaviors, right? So bias threatens validity, but not honesty. Social desirability can threaten, even though it's listed as a bias, it can threaten how honest a client is, but it's really threatening the validity. We address honesty through our clinical approach with clients. Okay, so another applied teaching example talking about reliability. So two clinicians rate client risk level for a particular thing. Low inter-rater reliability leads to inconsistent decisions. One clinician says, yes, they're suicidal. The other clinician says, no, I don't think they are. Okay, that's low inter-rater reliability. The solution is clear criteria and rater training, meaning we as clinicians or researchers, whatever your role will be when you get to your end destination of your academic journey, is that those who are going to be evaluating this information collected, measured, they need to be trained on how to evaluate the data, the information that has been measured. And then we have to have very clear criteria of what does this mean. And for us, if we use a suicide example, we literally ask, do they have a plan? And if they say yes, we ask what that plan is. And the more detailed and thought out it is, we're trained as practitioners on a clinical level to say, okay, this significantly increases risk. We need a contract for safety, or maybe we can't contract for safety and we need to call crisis support. It's pretty severe. I'm afraid to let my client leave. That's clear criteria and rater training. Okay, so the main teaching point here is that reliability affects fairness and outcomes. Fairness in terms of how individuals and programs are being evaluated, how we can trust the results of findings because of cultural bias and things that can, and systematic bias, other forms of systematic bias that can feed in there. It suddenly becomes unfair across populations. That's the biggest thing that we see. And then the outcomes. Can we trust that a research study that claims that serotonin is not linked to depression because of 11 research studies that only looked at serum levels of serotonin, that the authors tore to pieces and said they were terrible studies and had poor methodology, and they didn't look at any of the research that showed that antidepressants reduce depression, or that increasing serotonin increases neurogenesis in the hippocampus, which leads to the reduction in depression symptoms, which, FYI, just for fun, we actually know that is a main mechanism of reducing depression. That's why it takes 6 weeks, because serotonin levels raise immediately with SSRIs. So why does it take 6 weeks to feel better? It takes that time to grow in the brain. Structural differences in the hippocampus. They didn't include any of that research, and then drew this universal conclusion that we need to rethink using SSRIs to treat depression, and published it in Nature, which threw a whole bunch of professionals into an uproar and got some really nasty letters that were published to the editor about irresponsibility and ethics and gaps in that particular study. So I lost some faith in Nature at that point, because I never would have expected that would have been published. They must have known somebody. Anyway, moving on. All right, so validity and applied teaching examples. So a program uses attendance, for example, as a sole outcome measure. We're going to track attendance of participants in this program, and that's all we care about. The issue: attendance may not actually reflect behavior change. So let's say they're coming to DBT sessions, dialectical behavior therapy sessions, and you're tracking attendance, and you're like, look, 98% of participants attended all the time. So look how well our program is doing. That doesn't necessarily mean their symptoms are changing, right? Anecdotally, common sense wise, you understand that already as a clinician. This is just trying to make sense of how does it fit within the context of research. So attendance may not reflect the actual behavioral change. The solution in terms of research would be then to add functional and behavioral indicators, which anecdotally you would understand automatically. You would be like, who cares if they're showing up? Sometimes things happen. I need to know if they're, being able to regulate their emotions and their behavior better, if they're able to, establish and maintain intimate relationships better. Are they able to communicate better with the relationships that they already have, the people they have relationships with? You'd have this list as a clinician of these are the things that matter and what need to be addressed, what we need to be tracking. So that's the solution. Don't measure something that actually doesn't tell us if there's change, unless the whole purpose is we want people to attend and you're trying to change attendance. Otherwise, we add functional and behavioral indicators. So the teaching point really here is that validity asks, are we measuring the right thing? The thing that we want to change? That's what you really want to know, okay? All right. So the applied teaching example from the Povey article. The validated family functioning measures prevented deficit conclusions, meaning they could trust their conclusions and they were more detailed, gave them more information. The behavioral predictors clarified the sources of family stress for them so they could understand more about, okay, yeah, family's having stress, but what's causing this? The mixed methods approach, having qualitative and quantitative questions, added contextual meaning. It helped them understand more about the why and the how, okay, which matters. And the main teaching point here is that measurement choices, when we're doing research, shape the narratives about our outcomes. And in this specific example, it shaped the narratives about families. And that matters because we don't want to draw conclusions that are misleading, which has notoriously been done to marginalized communities. Like for as long as we have been doing research, trying to do any kind of comparison across cultural and ancestral differences in communities. So measurement choices shape those narratives, and then how we describe those narratives also make a difference. All right, practice integration takeaways. What are the main points here? Measurement decisions affect ethical practice. Okay. Reliability and validity have real world consequences. Okay. On the peoples and the programs and the communities that we serve, no matter what level it's occurring on. Good measurement supports just and effective services. All right, so let's look at a broader policy level example since some of you are far more macro. Measurement and program accountability. Let's talk about this. So the policy context here is state-funded outpatient mental health programs. The common metric is the number of clients served or sessions delivered. And this is real common when you've got grant money, they want to know how many people are you serving. But there's a limitation. Volume does not equal effectiveness or improvement. This is very similar to the attendance example. Just because we have a bunch of people in the community that we're serving, and I can show you that they're coming here, doesn't mean they're actually getting help, right? Anecdotally, I guarantee that at some point in your life, you have gone somewhere in some context in search of a resource or help. You attended, you showed up, okay? But then weren't able to get what you actually went there to get. You didn't get the resource or the support that you needed. And so, yeah, you were a number, right, of attendance, of being served, of showing up, but it didn't actually provide you what you went there for, okay? So this is the limitation, that volume does not equal effectiveness or improvement on an individual level, on a community level, program level, or on, even if we're looking at statewide or nationwide type changes. So the main teaching point here is that poor outcome measurement can incentivize ineffective services. Meaning, oh, if we're only going to track how many clients are served and how many sessions are delivered, you could have an agency that provides very poor service that continues to get funded. That continues to be the only resource available for the community, right? One common complaint in the South Side is the Syracuse Community Health Center. In desperate times, yes, they will use it, but most people, my neighbors especially, when I first moved here, I was like, oh, well, I can get in there quick instead of trying to go through upstate. And they were like, no, 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 do not go there. I literally had somebody tell me I went in with a list. These are all the things that I'm having issues with so that I can save your time. The doctor turned to me and said, okay, I have only 10 minutes to be with you, so we may not be able to talk about everything on your list. And then at the time, the tremor had already emerged, looked at me and said, I think it's just an essential tremor. I can't say for sure that it's an essential tremor, but I think it is. So here's a flyer on essential tremor. So don't do any nicotine, don't drink any caffeine, stay away from stimulants. And I was like, that's weird because nicotine actually lessens it. So that doesn't make sense. Are you sure that can you give me a referral to a brain doctor? Like, can you send me to a neurologist? She goes, I don't think that's necessary, and left. It took me a year to get into upstate and then 6 months to get into a neurologist who was like, no, you don't have an essential tremor. You have a cervical dystonic tremor. And this is the difference. The difference in the quality of care was significantly different. But one of the main metrics of Syracuse Community Health Center, and I'm not trying to be negative about them because a resource is a resource, and they do have a lot of different things they provide, especially to people who don't have insurance. So I'm not trying to be derogatory, but I am trying to create a comparison. They just got a ton of money to build a whole new building, close down another specialized agency unique to families and pregnant women because they integrated that care into theirs. Why did they get the money? Because they could show the numbers. Look at all of these clients that come through our door and how many sessions are delivered. So they got the grant money. We're able to build this nice new fancy building and continue to use that as a metric. While clients who go there, patients who go there consistently within the community complain about the quality of service. And if they have the option to go somewhere else, choose to go somewhere else because they know that the quality of care is different. So that is how poor outcome measurement through the lens of an applied example can incentivize ineffective services. All right. So another policy level example, reliability and equity in decision making. So the policy context is child welfare risk assessment tools. What's the chance this child's going to go into child welfare? The issue is low inter-rater reliability leads to inconsistent placement decisions, right? The worker's looking at it and saying, I agree they need to go into welfare, child welfare. I disagree they need to go into child welfare. The consequence is unequal treatment of families across counties or workers. And what you'll find often is this is cultural bias in the making. You will more often find marginalized children being pulled from their families and placed into welfare, specifically foster care. Sorry, I lost the word for a minute. Compared to their Anglo-American white counterparts, right? So this unequal treatment of families across counties or workers is specifically due to low inter-rater reliability because they haven't done proper rater training. They haven't operationalized the criteria of what it means and what is required to pull these children. They haven't addressed cultural bias, these kinds of things. So the main teaching point here is that reliability is an equity issue, not just a technical one. Okay? All right, let me stop share. I'm going to stop record and I will send you another video probably in about an hour, reviewing main ideas and concepts over the last 5 weeks to see if I can fill in some learning gaps for some of you who are feeling nervous. If you have questions about this, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I hope this was helpful and I hope everybody got home safe last night.